Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Christian Osterman, the director of the Center's History and Public Policy Program, which of course includes the Cold War International History Project that has been in existence here for more than 15 years. And to which today's discussion really pertains in many ways. Let me just say, for those of you who are watching us via the World Wide Web, webcast live, you can get further information on this program and future programs over our website, CWIHP, for Cold War International History Project, CWIHP.org. Let me also mention right up front our next event, which will be a somewhat larger event next week, April 24th, here at the Wilson Center, new scholarship on the Truman presidency and the Cold War, featuring a number of renowned Truman historians. And this event is being co-sponsored in cooperation with the Harry S. Truman Library Institute in Independence. You're welcome to join us for that event, which will take place again on April 24th. It's actually a full afternoon from 2 to 5, and then we'll have a reception at 5 o'clock. For the last 15 years or so, the Cold War International History Project here at the Wilson Center has been engaged in collecting, translating, publishing, discussing, disseminating in a variety of ways new evidence from the former communist world archives. I should say probably in part still communist country archives. We're now doing a lot of work in China. But also going well beyond the confines of the former communist world, and have tried to promote scholarship and discussion on these materials. That's been really the focus of our work, publications, hard copy, online publications, conferences, and a small fellowship program. Occasionally, we also feature important new books and publications here at the Center for discussion within the Washington community, and certainly the book that's under discussion today, Jeff Roberts' Stalin's Wars, is such a significant contribution to scholarship. We have collected we have put together, and we're very pleased to have here with us a distinguished panel of scholars that will discuss this book and put it into a larger context, I hope. This is important not just in scholarly terms, but increasingly, again, in political terms as well. Many of you may have read an important article published last year in Foreign Affairs by Sarah Mendelsohn and Theodore Gerber, Failing the Stalin Test, in which the authors argued that many Russians today hold ambivalent or even positive views of Stalin. For example, 1/4 or more of Russian adults say they would definitely or probably vote for Stalin were he alive and running for president, and less than 40% say they definitely would not. A majority of young Russians, moreover, do not view Stalin, a man responsible, after all, for millions of deaths and enormous suffering, with the revulsion he, the authors argue, deserves. Although Stalinism per se is not rampant in Russia today, misperceptions about the Stalin era are. Mendelsohn and Gerber argue that few of the respondents to the surveys they conducted could be classified as hardcore Stalinists, but fewer still were hardcore anti-Stalinists. most Russians. They therefore concluded flunked the Stalin test. Now, you can debate these findings, but what is clear is that these findings are connected, at least in part, to the loss of Russia's, of the Soviet Union's great power status with the end of the Cold War, a status that was intimately connected with Stalin, and that's why this publication and the discussion today, I hope, will go well beyond the confines of this book. As I said, we have a terrific panel here with us, taking advantage of Jeffrey Roberts, the author of Stalin's War, being here as a Kennan scholar, a Kennan research scholar, for several weeks with us. He, of course, is professor of history at the University of College Cork in Ireland. He is a frequent contributor to British, Irish, and American newspapers and popular history journals, and has acted as a consultant for a number of TV and radio documentaries. His publications include Victory at Stalingrad, published by Longman in 2002, and The Soviet Union and World Politics, published by Routledge in 1998. And of course now we can add to this list, again, Stalin's Wars from World War to Cold War, 1939 to 1953. To give a perspective on the book, to lead off the discussion, we have two commentators with us today from neighboring institutions, American University and George Mason University. Eric Lohr is the author of Nationalizing the Russian Empire, The Campaign Against Enemy Aliens During World War I, published by Harvard University Press. He also is the author of War and Revolution, 1914 to 1917. He is the co-editor of The Military and Society in Russian History, 1450 to 1917, published in 2002, and founder and chair of the Washington Russian and East European History Workshop. He is, I'm pleased to say, an alumnus of the Woodrow Wilson Center and was just with us 2 years ago as a 9-month Kennan Institute Research Fellow. Welcome back, Eric. Stephen Barnes, our final panelist, comes from George Mason University, where he joined the faculty in 2004. He received his PhD in Russian, Soviet, and East European history from Stanford University, 2003. His dissertation, entitled Soviet Society Confined, the Gulag in the Karaganda region of Kazakhstan, reconsiders the history of the Soviet system of forced labor, concentration camp, and internal exile through memoirs and recently opened archives of the Gulag system. He has done extensive field research in Russia and beyond, obviously in Kazakhstan, and has published in a variety of journals, including Critica and International Labor and Working Class History. We're also delighted to have you back. I know you're a close partner of the Kennan Institute here at the center, which I should mention, not be remiss mentioning, is a co-sponsor of today's session. Before I turn it over to Jeff to give us a presentation on the major findings from his new book, and then to Eric and Stephen for comments, let me thank my colleague Ryan Gage in the back, who has been helpful in putting this meeting together, and thanks to whom, and thanks to Jeff's effort, we can conclude this afternoon seminar over a glass of wine and a bite of cheese after about 5:30. With that, Jeff, you've got the stage, the floor. Welcome again.
Okay, thanks very much. First off, I'd like to thank the Cold War International History Project for arranging this event and giving me the opportunity to make a presentation on the book. Second, I'd like to thank Eric and Steve for agreeing to comment on the book. I thought I'd better thank them now, because I might not feel so generous after I've heard what they've got to say. I'd also like to thank the Kennan Institute, who's my the sponsor for this trip to Washington. The last time I was at the Kennan Institute was in September 2001, and I was able to do some very valuable research, which appears in the book, although my research was disrupted by certain external events. Okay, so the book. The book is a study of Stalin's military and political leadership from the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact to his death in March 1953. At the heart of the book is an account of the interaction between diplomacy, military strategy and politics in Stalin's leadership during the Second World War. But the book has another major theme, and that's the story of the origins of the Cold War from Stalin and from the Soviet point of view. And it's on that aspect of the book that I'm going to concentrate my opening remarks. Though, of course, I'm happy to discuss any other aspect of the book. What I have to say falls under three main headings. Firstly, the location of the book in the literature on the origins of the Cold War. Secondly, the sources that underpin the book's analysis of the Cold War. And thirdly, some points about the main findings of the book in relation to Stalin and the Cold War. Okay, let me begin under this heading of the location in the literature of the book. Let me give you some personal history. The origins of the book go back to the 1970s, when I was a graduate student at the London School of Economics, trying to write a thesis on the Soviet Union and the origins of the Cold War from 1941 to 1947. I was a great admirer of the American revisionist historians, and I wanted to complement their work on American foreign policy by a detailed study of the Soviet role in the origins of the Cold War. The problem was that at that time the Russian archives were closed and there were very few primary Soviet sources available in published form. So I was faced with the prospect of writing a thesis based on Western sources and on published sources such as the Soviet press. Now, for various reasons which I won't go into, I didn't want to do that, although I have to say in the late 70s and early 80s, several very good books were actually published using those two sets of sources. But I decided to go with another project, which was a study of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. The reason for that being that at that time, the 1970s, a number of primary sources on Soviet foreign policy, published archive documents, were becoming increasingly available, and that is basically the origins of various books and articles I wrote on the Nazi-Soviet Pact, including my first book, The Unholy Alliance, which was published in 1989. Now, when I came back to my original thesis topic, the Cold War was over, the Russian archive, which was in the mid-1990s, the Cold War was over, the Russian archives were open, a whole host of material from the archives were being published. And there were also a number of Western and Russian historians who were working on many different aspects of the topic of Stalin and the Cold War. But most of this work was concentrated on the post-war period, not a lot on the Grand Alliance and wartime diplomacy, so I thought there was a space for a book examining both the Grand Alliance and the early Cold War. Later on, I expanded the chronological time frame of the book and, more importantly, also took on the task of assessing Stalin's military leadership. Now, did I achieve my youthful ambition to write a revisionist history of the Soviet Union and the origins of the Cold War? Well, at least one reviewer thinks I did. Joseph Goulden, writing in the Washington Times, he said of the book, and I quote, As to Stalin and the Cold War, I will simply say that Mr. Roberts spouts some of the revisionism that even left-wing academics, American academics, have seen fit to abandon. I don't believe that for a moment. Gordon does acknowledge, however, the research that went into the book and says that Stalin's Wars is a remarkable historical work. So, revisionist rubbish, remarkable historical work, go figure. But he concludes, and this is one point I do agree with him, he says that what I say in the book should not be accepted at its face value. I couldn't agree more. Actually, despite Gordon's characterisation, I don't think the book is a revisionist text. Although, and I'll explain why I don't think it's revisionist in a few minutes, but I can see why some people would want to characterise it as such a text. Because one of the central narrative strands of the book is the story of how during the Great Patriotic War Stalin came to embrace the perspective of a peacetime grand alliance with Britain and the United States. A long-term alliance that would establish a long-term détente with the capitalist world and that would provide a framework for the tripartite pursuit of common interests. Above all, the long-term subjugation of Germany and Japan and the avoidance of a new world war. Stalin clung to this perspective for quite some time after the war, notwithstanding various clashes and conflicts with the Western powers in the early post-war years. Only in mid-1947, I argue, after the launch of the Marshall Plan, did Stalin finally embrace a Cold War perspective and completely seal off the Soviet Communist bloc in Eastern Europe from the rest of the continent. Even so that's not the end of my revisionism, Stalin remained concerned about the consequences of the Cold War, and so concerned by the late 1940s and early 1950s, he resumed the course of seeking a détente with the West. So, according to my narrative of the Soviet role in the origins of the Cold War, the Rooseveltian strategy of containment through integration, as John Gaddis termed it, was perfectly feasible, had it been pursued more consistently, more persistently, and perhaps more sensitively in the early post-war years. An acceptable post-war settlement with the Soviets would have been difficult and costly and not a little risky in political terms. But it might have averted the Cold War, might have led to a more relaxed Soviet communist regime in Eastern Europe, and might have provided a fruitful context for the political reform and liberalisation of the USSR itself, even under Stalin. Now, all of that, of course, would be music to the ears of many revisionist historians, and indeed, well, if they were still alive, there's many Cold War critics of American Cold War foreign policy at the time. Not just left-wing and liberal critics, but conservative critics who put forward many of the same arguments that I put forward in the book, except hopefully I put forward it with a much stronger evidential basis. But having said that, I don't think Stalin's Wars is a revisionist book. And the reason I don't think it's a revisionist book is because of my treatment of ideology. For me, communist ideology as aspiration, as perception, as discourse, and as narrative is absolutely central to the understanding of Stalin's post-war strategy and policy. My argument is, and this is an argument I share with a number of traditionalist and post-traditionalist historians, is that Stalin emerged from the Second World War with ideological ambitions as well as security concerns. In the short term, Stalin foresaw considerable gains for the communists across Europe. In the longer term, he saw the emergence of a continent of left-wing regimes that will form part of a process of a European transition to socialism, a transition that the Soviets generally called people's democracy. Stalin thought that he would be able to combine a peacetime grand alliance with the people's democracy project, but what he didn't appreciate was the disturbing effect of the Soviet and communist challenge on Western perceptions of his Cold War policy. There was no Soviet and communist threat as defined by Western propaganda, but there was definitely a Soviet and communist challenge to the capitalist status quo. And one way of meeting that challenge, successful actually, was the Cold War. Where I differ from the traditionalist and post-traditionalist historians, at least some of them, is that I don't see the Cold War as a necessary or desirable method of meeting that challenge, and see preferable alternative policies that might have led Stalin to moderate his ideological ambitions. To that extent, my view of Stalin, Soviet ideology and the Soviet system is very different from the traditionalist one, in that I don't see any inherent obstacles within the ideology to a post-war compromise that could have averted the Cold War. So, in terms of the old debate about the origins of the Cold War, I see my book as a piece of post-revisionism, but a piece of post-revisionism that incorporates significant elements of traditionalist and post-traditionalist analysis of the Soviet role in the origins of the Cold War. Okay, the problem is that the definitional waters have been muddied a little bit by John Gaddis, who famously defined post-revisionism as a repudiation of the importance of ideology. And then when he reinvented himself as a post-traditionalist, he defined post-traditionalism as the belief that Stalin and Soviet ideology and the Soviet system made the Cold War all but inevitable, a view which I don't share. I would also see my work as part of the new post-Cold War historiography, a historiography that's been striving to transcend the Cold War discourse. Okay, while this Cold War historiography is very diverse, I would highlight three common analytical themes. Firstly, well, I just talked about the importance of the role of ideology. Secondly, the centrality and pervasiveness of Stalin to Soviet decision-making. The one thing we've learned from getting into the arguments about how central Stalin was to everything important that was going on, and this kind of notion we used to have about interest groups, lobbyists, other powerful actors, it really doesn't make any sense in the light of new evidence. There's only one important, powerful actor, certainly in relation to foreign policy in the Cold War, and that is Stalin. Okay, and thirdly, the complexity and contradiction of Stalin's decision-making as revealed by the new archive evidence. A complexity and contradiction that doesn't fit with either the revisionist or with the traditionalist stereotypes. Okay, which brings me to the question of sources. Okay, the book's sources are set out in the notes and in the bibliography. And what you'll see that I did quite a lot of work in the Foreign Ministry archive and in the main party archive for this period and in various other archives. While a number of scholars have worked on the same archival sources, not many have seen the number and range of files that I have. One of the particular features of my research in the Mead archive, the Foreign Ministry archive, was its concentration on Soviet preparations for participation in the various international conferences of the period, Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, Martin Oaks, the Paris Peace Conference, and so on. And it's that piece of research that buttresses my contentions about Stalin's attitude towards Grand Alliance and Soviet efforts to maintain the Grand Alliance in some form after the Second World War. I should say that that particular focus of my research was a forced focus because they wouldn't let me see any other material, because at that time, I'm thinking it's still in place, there was a ban on foreign scholars seeing any of the high-level cipher telegram traffic. So I was forced to concentrate on the internal preparations for these various conferences. Okay, but as well as the archives, equally important to my research has been the thousands of Soviet archive documents that have been published, not just in the last 15 years or so, but in Soviet times too. The book's bibliography lists over 100 volumes of published archive documents in Russian alone, not just diplomatic documents, but many volumes on military affairs, and more recently there's been a number of publications, collections on post-war Soviet domestic politics. And in my view, I and everyone else has hardly scratched the surface of this huge array of published documentation. Okay, but there's another important point I'd like to make under this heading of sources. The public Soviet sources were just as important to my research as the archived documents. As Wojciech Masny famously said, the biggest secret of the Soviet archives is that there is no secret. What was being said in private by the Soviets was more or less the same as what was being said in public. What the Soviets were saying in speeches, in the Soviet press, in public documentations, documents and in conversations with foreign diplomats formed part of a continuum of private and public discourse about foreign policy and international relations. Indeed, much of the material published in the Soviet press, I discovered, quite often began life as internal briefing documents. Equally common were instructions to Soviet diplomats to read Pravda and Izvestia to get their orientation on current policy. What access to the Soviet archives taught me to appreciate is the value of the public sources. And the point I always make about my research is this: the most single useful thing I did in 10, 12 years of research was to actually read through Pravda and Izvestia from 1941 through to 1947. Okay, so given that perspective, what I try to do in the book is to provide an integrated account of Stalin and Soviet policy that draws on archives, on the published archival sources, and on the public sources as well. As far as Stalin is concerned, what he was saying in public and in press statements, as well as his conversations with foreigners, were an essential source for my understanding of him and his politics and policy. Now, that's not to deny the importance of the great accumulation of new material on Stalin since the end of the Cold War, and the Cold War International History Project has played a central role in this process of accumulating new material. This new material, as far as Stalin is concerned, includes Soviet and communist records of Stalin's conversations, more complete versions of Stalin's remarks at Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam. One of the things I was able to do was to see the original Soviet transcripts of these conferences, and luckily for me, they'd left lots of things out in the published versions. There's some significance to that. We have the diary records of various statements made by Stalin, by Dimitrov and others. We have Stalin's internal diplomatic correspondence, or at least some of it, especially with Molotov when he was absent from Moscow, material that's been accessed by various Russian historians. And we have Stalin's post-war holiday correspondence with members of the Politburo. That's to say, the communications he had with him while he was spending his long holidays on the Black Sea after the war. I would also say, that's not directly relevant to this discussion today, on the military side, we have access to hundreds of wartime documents and communications signed by Stalin, as well as the transcripts of many telephone and telegraphic conversations that he had with his front commanders. What this material, when it's combined with the old sources and with the public sources, means is that we have as much stuff on Stalin as we do on most Western political leaders. There's some gaps in the evidence that may be filled in time, but I would say that as of now we know pretty much everything we are going to know about Stalin's policies, decisions, actions and calculations during the last decade of his life. At least as far as foreign policy and military affairs are concerned. I think when you talk about domestic affairs, things are a little bit more uncertain. But more evidence and greater knowledge does not necessarily mean greater certainty. In Stalin's case, the direct evidence of his innermost thoughts and calculations remains rather limited. So there's still plenty of scope for speculation and guesswork, and hence for differing interpretations. One of the things I tried to do in the book was to present all the important evidence regarding Stalin's thinking and motivations. And in fact, more than one reviewer has commented that the material presented in the book lends itself to alternative interpretation. Well, that's fine by me. The subject matter of the book is too complex, contradictory and uncertain to be tied together in a neat narrative insulated from all criticism. I conceived the book as an open-ended narrative that would facilitate alternative interpretations as well as being a vehicle for my own views. When I was writing the book, I often felt like A.J.P. Taylor said once himself, a man of strong views but weakly held. Okay, how much time have I got?
A couple more minutes.
Fine, I'll take 5, if that's okay.
Okay,
Right?
but no
Fine.
more.
I just want to finish by sort of just pointing out, maybe for the purposes of discussion, some of the main findings of the book, and I'll kind of gloss over these because I don't want to take up too much more time. Firstly, Stalin's main motivation for supporting a continuation of the Grand Alliance after the war was his fear of a German and Japanese revival. I mean, he never stops talking about this during the war. Never, ever stops talking about it. And that concern continues after the Cold War until his death in 1953. So I think that's quite a central point to understand his policy. Secondly, although the Soviet declaration of the Cold War dates from 1947, from the establishment of Comintern, and was in response to the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, the seeds of that radical policy shift began to be shown as early as September 1945, or maybe actually as early as the summer of 1945. And what the seeds were growing Soviet perceptions of the re-emergence in Western states of anti-communist and anti-Soviet sources. The post-war rise of forces hostile to the Soviet Union was the central thread of both the private and public Soviet narrative of the deterioration of Soviet-Western relations. Thirdly, the authenticity of the People's Democracy Project, i.e. Stalin's genuine belief in this transitional form of regime which was going to take a democratic form. I cite all the evidence there is for that in the book, but that's something maybe we can discuss further. Authentic or not, it was abandoned pretty quickly and easily, wasn't it, in 1946, 1947, 1948, which says a lot about Soviet ideology and its different potentialities. One potentiality pointing in the direction of this kind of democratic kind of concept of a transition to socialism. The other concept pointing in the direction of a more fundamentalist and dogmatic concept of capitalism and the struggle against it. Fourthly, what I call the revolutionary patriotic paradigm. Just very briefly here, Zubok and Pleshakov, in their book, famous book, proposed a revolutionary imperial paradigm as an explanatory framework within which to explain post-war Soviet foreign policy. In my book, I don't actually use this phrase, but what the argument is actually is that a more appropriate concept is the revolutionary patriotic paradigm. And so what the argument is about is the whole impact of the importance of the Soviet Union and Stalin's patriotic identity on their post-war policy. Again, I'll have to skip over. Okay, fine, I'm going to come to an end here and just say this. Quite simply, I think, having listened to me, we can safely say that I failed the Stalin test. But I hope that, at the very least, the book represents an interesting failure of the Stalin test and an interesting and fruitful exploration of all the new evidence that has become available on this particular question in the last 15 years or so.
Thank you, Jeff. Eric, you want to start?
Well, thank you, Professor Roberts, for talking about the last 100 pages of the book. I would like to talk about the main thesis of the book, which was, in the introduction, stated as the detailed reconstruction and interpretation of Stalin's war record, which is the main subject of this book. And I notice that you have not mentioned that yet. The thesis which you state is very provocative. It's that Stalin was an effective war leader. In fact, he was irreplaceable and even the only one who could have won the war. This is the main thrust of the argument in the book. It takes up the first 260 pages of 372 pages of text. And it's a bit puzzling that all of the archival work that went into this book appears in the last 100 pages, not the first 260. The first part of the book, which makes the main argument, simply is not as seriously researched, and far too often the arguments are simply asserted rather than thoroughly argued. And I'd like to just give one example of this. In a section titled "Stalin Saves Moscow," the claim is made that Stalin produced a masterly performance. But the only evidence that is given is quotes from 2 patriotic speeches and NKVD reports that the speech of Stalin inspired confidence in the population of Moscow. There's been a great deal of scholarship on the reliability of NKVD reports, and that is not noted. Although there's not a word about tactics and strategy, Stalin's intervention in tactics and strategy in the Battle of Moscow, the conclusion is still put forth that Stalin's intervention may well have made the difference between victory and defeat. Generally, there's very little detailed analysis of Stalin's strategic and military leadership in this book. And if you're assessing his role as wartime leader, one would think that that would be central. I would like to find, I didn't find in the book, an example of a wise intervention of Stalin in wartime strategy. On the contrary, even in this book, we find many examples of very unwise interventions in wartime strategy. We know all about the folly of the forward placement of troops at the beginning of the war, the failure to order preparations for a possible invasion, the resulting massive losses in the first weeks of the war. Now, the claim in the book is that this was not Stalin's fault so much as his generals, who insisted on an offensive posture and approach to fighting. This is a very strange argument, of course, because Stalin himself had purged his more experienced officers in 1937. These were his people that he had chosen, and to blame them for following Stalin's lead is peculiar. Now, how can we explain this incredible failure of leadership? I don't know how else one can characterize it. An incredible failure of leadership to combine forward placement of half of all the Soviet troops on the border with a strategy of not provoking Hitler into an attack. The result was clear. The pincher movements, the large sweeping pincher movements of the panzer attack forces encircled a large portion of these troops in the front, taking millions prisoner. It's hard to imagine. Certainly, one of the arguments in the book is that there was a general ethos of the offensive that all of the commanders in the Soviet army shared, and Stalin was part of this. And certainly that's true. And certainly Tukhachevsky was one of the innovators of this offensive mentality, this offensive strategy, and such. But can you really say that if he had been present, he wouldn't have objected to such a clearly mistaken policy? Where is Stalin's leadership then? Where does it come from? Well, the argument is made that Stalin showed his mettle by learning from his mistakes. Well, is that true? Actually, if you look at the record of the first few months of the war, Stalin compounded his initial mistake by insisting that his generals undertake a policy of stand and fight. Of course, stand and fight meant stand and wait while you're encircled and taken prisoner. And we know the death rates in the Nazi camps of prisoners. I believe they were in the 60 percentile somewhere. It was essentially losing the troops through a policy that did not have broad support from all the generals. This is a claim that has been refuted by many people. The argument is presented in a very confusing way. On page 100, there's a confusing succession of paragraphs. First, the claim is made that it's not fair to blame Stalin for the Red Army's offensive orientation in summer 1941. It wasn't, quote, Stalin's personal creation or responsibility, but part of the Red Army's strategic tradition and military culture. Then the next paragraph admits Stalin fully shared these misconceptions and as supreme commander bore ultimate responsibility for their disastrous consequences. and goes on to quote A.G.B. Taylor, saying Stalin's dedication to the doctrine of offensive brought upon the Soviet armies greater catastrophes than any other armies have ever known. This is a strong statement, and certainly is an admission that deeply undermines the basic argument of this book, that Stalin was an effective and even irreplaceable leader during the war. Millions and millions of soldiers and civilians died needlessly as a result of this mistake. Far more industrial plant and territory was lost than if troops had been placed further back from the border. Clearly, even if human life has no value in one's assessment of Stalin as a strategist, even so, people are strategically valuable, and they were lost. Territory and industrial plant was lost on a massive scale. Now, many memoirs of generals, document collections, and scholarly studies show that Stalin intervened frequently to force offensives upon generals who objected that they were not ready to launch these offensives. And that continued throughout the war. There was not, I don't believe, the learning process that you speak of. Certainly, the extremity was reduced. It'd be hard to continue to replicate the disasters of the first year. You just simply run out of troops. But it continued. And just to give one example, allow me to read from Alexander Nekrich, who, by the way, I'm sure most people are aware, was one of the most influential figures in debates about June 22nd, 1941, and was driven out of the country. As a result, he published his book in 1965, creating a major controversy. He continued to work, and I met him at Harvard when I was a graduate student there, and he told me many, many long personal stories about offensives being launched before troops were ready to launch those offensives. Well, in the interest of time, I won't read it, but it's an example from just one of many examples where the troops were not ready, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives were lost as a result. So, did he learn from his mistakes? Well, to a degree he did. But to the point where he was rationally marshalling his forces instead of pointlessly wasting them? No way. No way. Just a personal story to illustrate some of this. In this book, there's a sort of lack of personal stories, a lack of a sense for the people who fought this war. It's a story of Stalin and what he's doing. Just a personal story. In the early 1990s, I was near Red Square. There's a large monument to Zhukov, which had recently been unveiled. Massive, with the tail sticking straight up. It's a very strange monument. But there was an old World War II veteran standing there with his jacket full of medals. And I asked him, well, is this a big moment? Are you proud that this has been unveiled? And he spat on the ground, and he said, Zhukov and Stalin, I was in the drive to Berlin in 1945. Zhukov and Stalin, if they had waited 1 or 2 more days to consolidate our positions and get our artillery in place, all my friends who are gone would be here today. And it was countless examples of this. One could easily find them, of the incredible irrational way in which Stalin prosecuted the war effort. Irreplaceable? I think not. It's not only the question is not only asked in the book. It is not asked in the book about whether Stalin could have won the war with millions fewer casualties. It's not seriously addressed. Nor are the terrible costs of his policies towards civilians during the war even mentioned. Of course, we all know about the mass deportations of Tatars, Volga Germans, Chechens, Meskhetian Turks. Every single man, woman, and child of these ethnic groups rounded up and deported, about 1.5 million total during the war. As many as 20-25% may have died in the process. We don't really know the exact figures. Could you imagine a Turkish historian writing a history of the First World War and not even mentioning the Armenian genocide?
Oh, yes, I can.
Of course you can. What about a Soviet? What about a Soviet one? Not even. What about someone writing about World War II not even mentioning these deportations. That's what this book does. There's not a single word about these deportations.
Sorry, that's just not true.
I didn't see it.
I'll find it and read it out.
Okay, you can find it.
And the actual figures, I actually mention them several times in the book. So that's just
Several
not true.
times?
Absolutely.
Well, find it, because I did
I'll
not see
find
it.
it in a minute. But can you just remember, all the points you've made, all the critical points about Stalin, you can all find them in the book.
Well,
this is where you got most of them from. So much for me ignoring things. Come on.
No, but
Come on, it's all in the book.
That's
Everything
not
you
all
said,
in the book.
everything
It's
you said
ridiculous.
has come from the book. Come on.
Let's finish the
Sorry,
comments,
sorry,
then we'll
I'm
have
just-
time to respond.
to contribute, how does any of what I've said, and some of which is in the book, how does any of it contribute to the argument that Stalin was an irreplaceably talented and rational leader during the war? It just doesn't at all. So I don't know. It's the attitude in the book also is just generally let me move on to some three comments or points for discussion, general discussion that aren't addressed in the book. One, if you're assessing Stalin as wartime leader, it would seem to make sense, clearly, to discuss economic mobilization. I think most scholars agree that this is a better explanation for Soviet victory than Stalin's tactical and strategic genius. There's been a lot of work done on it. John Barber and Mark Harrison have done a great deal of recent important work that shows that Soviet mobilization in economic terms and in all terms was greater than Nazi mobilization by many times, and certainly greater than any other society before. One could certainly make a stronger case for Stalin's leadership by talking about how he was able to direct every resource towards the war than discussing his field leadership. The argument in the book is that Stalin was a great war leader and necessary for victory. The book doesn't really get into an explanation of what is meant by this. Does it mean that the Stalinist system was superior to the Nazi and capitalist systems in mobilizing for war? Or does it mean that Stalin was a better military strategist and thinker than the generals around him, than Tukhachevsky? Are you saying that the Soviet Union may have lost the war if Stalin had not been in charge? There's really not a sort of comparative and counterfactual analysis in the book. Engagement in the book, and I suspect it's because it would be hard to maintain the argument if this was done. If it just a basic counterfactual test, is it really likely that no one could have performed better than Stalin in the first 4 months of the war? It just doesn't seem conceivable. And while I mentioned the structure of the book, it's let me just raise one more point about this. The introduction claims that the main argument of the book is about Stalin's wartime leadership. The presentation that you gave made clear that the origins of the book are in foreign policy revisionism on the historiography of the origins of the Cold War. My question that I don't think the book really resolved is, how are these two halves related? How does the issue of Stalin's wartime performance bear in a direct way on the question of the origins of the Cold War? I don't think it's a very direct relationship, and certainly not one of the more important variables in explaining all the multitude of other factors that came to play in the central argument of the second half, that Stalin really intended a long-term alliance and that factors outside of his control led to the failure of that. The other question or sort of thing that the book could do but doesn't is to situate itself among recent arguments about the nature of the Soviet system. Thurston, Getty, and others have argued there's a great deal more popular support and input from below in making of policy, in the dynamic of purges and et cetera, than most people think. On the surface, the account is very much focused on all-controlling Stalin, controlling society in a top-down fashion, and it's the opposite model of the revisionist paradigm. So I'm wondering how you see your, or what you've learned from your close study of Stalin about the nature of how the Soviet system worked, and how you relate to this other revisionist argument about the domestic structure of the Soviet system. Was it comparable in some ways to recent models of the German wartime, Ian Kershaw's German wartime model of a sort of system of working towards the Fuhrer, where generals tried to outdo each other in their radicalism, the radicalism of their proposals to gain to curry his favor. Was there some sort of dynamic like that in the Soviet Union? And I'll just stop there.
Okay. I'm a specialist on, and I was asked to comment on and try to place this book into the perspective of those who write about the domestic history of Stalinism, what happens in the Soviet Union. I think, in a way, sort of this question of the Stalinist system leads off into what I'm going to talk about. But this is a book that, I mean, it's hard to avoid commentary on issues, I think, similar to what Eric raises. I hope it doesn't seem too much like I'm piling on, but it is, in many ways, a deeply troubling book. But let's start, first off, with the charge that I've been given and try to put this in perspective a little bit. How did the Soviet Union win the war? And it is, I think, fundamentally or overwhelmingly a book about the war and then also about sort of what comes out of that after. And I understand with this being the Cold War project that you probably focus on that part of the book. But, you know, fundamentally in the field of Soviet history, we ask this question: how did the Soviet Union win the war? How is it that the Red Army did not completely collapse in the summer and fall of 1941 when the Nazi blitzkrieg swept across the western parts of the Soviet Union? How is it that this horribly brutal Stalinist regime of the 1930s managed to survive the early disastrous stage of this war intact? You know, and perhaps in some ways, I think if you're outside of the Soviet field, you can see this book as part of a broad shift toward a greater appreciation of the importance of the Eastern Front in the Second World War. A large body of scholarship is certainly emerging in this vein, and I would just note that there's a review article in the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly, which mentions this book among many, many others, that focus on the Eastern Front. But of course, for scholars of Soviet history, for somebody like myself, it's not really news that the Soviet Union essentially won the Second World War, and that the war's outcome really pivoted on the Eastern Front. I'm sure I'm not alone among my colleagues in teaching Russian or Soviet history in reminding my students frequently that D-Day, in fact, happens 3 years after the launch of Operation Barbarossa. Now, Jeffrey Roberts' book here focuses on the pinnacle of leadership to answer this question of how the system survived the war. Other recent studies have sought other fundamental questions about the war, and especially the question of why Soviet soldiers in particular continue to fight for this regime. Old explanations focused entirely on repression as the means to motivate soldiers to fight no longer suffice. And such explanations certainly run smack into the significant amount of evidence that we have of real enthusiasm for the fight at the Soviet front line. And I would note, for example, just Catherine Merridale's book, Ivan's War, which seeks to grapple in a very serious way with the multiple motivations for the Soviet frontline fighting soldier in this war. I think it's a book that is just the first of many on this topic. As I've taught it with my grad students, it's a deeply problematic book in a lot of ways, but it asks the right questions. A serious scholarly study, though, of why they fought, of how the Soviet Union won the war, I think has to grapple with the Soviet state, with the economy, with the social structure that entered the war. And I think one certainly would have liked to see much more of this in Roberts' study. There's a tremendous amount of scholarship that shows the real enthusiasm with which many, though certainly not all, Soviet citizens, quote-unquote, built socialism. There's scholarship that explores how the Soviet people related to the regime, how they related to Stalin, how they related to the outside world, exploring, in fact, what kinds of information people even had about their world and in which to understand it. A tremendous amount of work has been done in the last 15 years on these questions. These are the things that shape the worldview of the soldiers that Stalin and the Soviet state would call on to fight in this war, and one really gets no sense of this from Roberts' book. Ideology, I have to say, you know, there's certainly been a strong shift toward a focus on ideology in Soviet historiography, and it's just not here. I would have liked to have seen some consideration of the work of people like Igor Halfin, Stephen Kotkin, Jochen Helbeck, Amir Viner, people who have really grappled with what this question of ideology means in the Soviet Union, because it's not simple, it's not easy, and it's certainly not just a return to some traditional notion of ideology. Robert's book, I think, certainly fits to a degree within a line of recent scholarship that forces us to reconsider Stalin as the man. No longer is it typical to place Stalin's psychology at the center of our understanding of his actions. He may, in fact, have been paranoid, or he may not have. But without question, his paranoia was well suited to a Bolshevik ideology that imagined a world made of enemies, a world bent on the destruction of the socialist state they were creating. And I think here of recent biographies of Stalin, for example, by Bob Service, by Hiroki Kurmiya. There's a recent study of Stalin's political philosophy by Eric von Rhee, publications of Stalin's private correspondence, the emergence of materials from his personal archive, some of this Jeff mentions. All of these things have led us toward a picture that I think in some ways Jeff's book sits comfortably with, a picture of Stalin who was less cynical, who was more of a true believer, who was more of an ideologue, and who was more intellectually engaged. I don't think it is tenable for the most part anymore to present Stalin as some sort of incredible mediocrity, the way that Trotsky did already so many years ago. Nonetheless, the best recent scholarship does not deny, it does not miss, and it certainly does not even downplay the incredible violence that emerged from the system that Stalin created and that drove Stalin himself. What we know, though, is that it is not so easy to let ourselves off the hook now by attributing all of this to Stalin being paranoid or crazy. Whether it be beatings by his father, feelings of inadequacy, mental illness, and whatever it was attributed to, it's just not that simple. History's not going to let us off that easy. We cannot dismiss Stalin merely as a psychopath and therefore make ourselves feel better that all of this was some kind of aberration. Among other things, much like scholarship on the Holocaust, for example, and other incidents of genocide and mass political violence, we know, frankly, simply put, Stalin did not kill all of these people by himself. So in our reevaluations of Stalin, then, we are still left with incredible gaps to fill in regards to his thinking and his actions. Why precisely did he launch the Great Terror of 1937 and 38? We know he did it, but we'll never know for sure his inner motivations. There's no smoking gun out there in the archives. Jeff's right about this. The huge gap between what we want to know and the available evidence creates incredible problems for the historian. And I think the best that we can hope to do is to be very upfront and very honest about what we know and where it is that we are making guesses and suppositions. And this brings me then to Stalin's wars. Jeffrey Roberts takes off from this new focus on the war in the East, on how the Soviet Union won this war and on the reevaluation of Stalin, and gives us a story that presents Stalin as the ultimate victor of the war. Fair enough. I mean, I'm sympathetic with the notion that Stalin played a role in this victory, though there are these important counterfactual questions that we need to spend a lot of time thinking about. Was he the only leader? Was this the only style of leadership? Was this brutality and the extreme loss of life on the Soviet side? Was all this necessary for this victory? I think Roberts perhaps goes to extremes at times in giving Stalin the benefit of the doubt about these questions. Here then is, in a way, the fundamental problem for me with the book. At almost every point, when faced with, and even when presenting contradictory evidence or a shortage of evidence, Roberts seems to give Stalin the benefit of the doubt. Repeatedly, it seems that if something goes wrong, and take here the offensive posture of the Red Army that Eric talked about, for example, repeatedly then, if something like this goes wrong, it seems that we cannot attribute it to Stalin, but rather it is position shared by his top military commanders. How independent, by the way, one might ask, could these generals and their opinions be, given Roberts' own description elsewhere of men like Gromyko and Litvinov and Maisky as operating carefully within Stalin's orbit, trying to anticipate and mouth his positions. I'll quote here from the book, in Stalin's Russia, the terms of discussion were highly restrictive and usually set by the Soviet dictator himself. In the alternative, it seems, if something went wrong, it wasn't actually Stalin's fault. So Stalin's failure, this from the next to the last paragraph of the book, Stalin's failure to make better use of that victory from a democratic view was undoubtedly a function of the political limitations of his dictatorial regime. But it also occurred because Western politicians were unable to see that beyond the alleged communist threat was an opportunity to arrive at a post-war settlement that could have averted the Cold War and avoided ideological warfare. You know, I ask here, does Roberts really think that different political thinking in the West would have turned Stalin's dictatorship into a democracy? And notice the way in which, and he does say, of course, that undoubtedly, right, that this is about Stalin's dictatorship, but that undoubtedly the use of that word, it's almost grudging. It's almost as if, well, okay, but let's make sure we focus on what else is going on. Not really, I suspect, if I ask Jeff right now, does he believe that different policies on the part of Truman or Churchill would have turned this into a democracy? I don't think that's it at all. Rather, it all seems to be set up a claim that Stalin defeated Hitler and helped save the world for democracy. There's a lot of this book that seems intentionally provocative, intentionally designed to try to get a reaction, and I guess it worked.
Really?
But of course, to say that Stalin saved the world for democracy, you can't help us step back and say, well, okay, but unless you're in Poland or in Estonia or in Latvia or in Czechoslovakia or on and on and on, right? If something goes right, then in the book, needless to say, it is typically emphasized as a victory that is all or mostly Stalin's alone, and we don't need to spend too much time troubling ourselves with the question of the cost of the victory, because again, that's not really Stalin's fault. And I actually had my own section on Stalin Saves Moscow and how it's all about these speeches, but I'll leave that out because Eric talked about it. All of this, I think, what troubles me, I guess, about this is that all of it points to this issue. There's an unquestioning, to some degree, use of source material whenever it supports Robert's view, matched with a tremendous skepticism of any source material that counters this point of view. And let me pick just one example, but I'd say there are many. Roberts asserts in his chapter on the war's onset, quote, Stalin did not believe in exporting revolution by force of arms. So for the thorough few who go and check the footnotes, we find that the source is Stalin's interview with the American journalist Roy Howard in 1936. We get no sense in the text itself that there's any possibility that Stalin had some other motivation, possibly to be prevaricating when dealing with the American journalist at a time in which he's trying to improve relations with the Western countries. And just for kicks, the very next sentence appears to contradict the previous one when Roberts tells us, quote, but Stalin did see the Red Army as a liberating force whose incursion into foreign territory could have a positive political impact from a communist point of view. However, when treating the negative evaluations in General's memoirs or by Khrushchev or whomever, all seem to be evidence that somebody had a political axe to grind. And that it thus obscures the general sense or the general trend of these sources. So, I fear I'm going on a bit too long, but I think these are problems that have to be raised. In the concluding paragraph of the book, Roberts writes, quote, that history can be a kind of court. The prosecution wants us to condemn Stalin outright for his crimes or for his inadequate leadership. But as jurors, it is our duty to review all the evidence, including that for the defense, and to see the whole picture. And the problem that I found repeatedly, to be perfectly frank, is it seems that Jeff is not being a juror, but he's being defense counsel. So I just want to remind us for a minute to not forget the case for the prosecution. So to present the war as a time of liberalization, as he does, and I have to say you're, of course, not the only person who talks about the Stalinist dictatorship in this way during the war, but it's problematic to say the least. If it was liberalization for some, it was certainly not if you were a Soviet citizen who was German, Chechen, English, Crimean, Tatar, etc. I will stand up, by the way, for Jeff that it is in the book, but it is so buried, and in a chapter actually on the post-war, that it's kind of hard to find. And it doesn't really have much impact on what's going on during the war. All those nationalities, though, deported to Siberia and Central Asia in their entirety with great loss of life. When the battle rages, isn't it interesting, Stalin turns significant resources and significant attention to this question of deporting these people. It is not liberalization if you're one of the 800,000 plus inmates to die in the Gulag during the war. I'm almost finished. This is the deadliest period in the history of the Gulag. This, of course, is my specialty, and I'll pick on a few issues here. It is not liberalization if you're one of the political prisoners who was in a prison near the front who was shot instead of being evacuated. Maria Spiridonova, for example, a well-known left SR from the time of the revolution, was executed in this fashion. It was not liberalization if you were Estonian, if you were Latvian, if you were Lithuanian, Western Ukrainian, Western Belarusian, if you're one of the Poles who lived in any of those regions. And finally, I just want to say a bit about the treatment of the domestic sphere, which he does do for the post-war period. And his conclusion, which he states at the very beginning of the preface, his third conclusion, that Stalin's post-war domestic regime was very different to the Soviet system of the pre-war years. It was less repressive, more nationalistic, and not so dependent on Stalin's will and whimsy for its everyday functioning. It was a system in transition to the relatively more relaxed social and political order of post-Stalin times. The process of de-Stalinization began while Stalin was alive, although the cult of personality reigned supreme in the Soviet Union until the day he died. Simply put, the post-war period was not and cannot be understood as one of transition from a system based on purges and tears. Okay, 1937 and 1938 do not happen again. It was a singular event in Soviet history in which the Soviet state killed an average of 1,500 people per day. This does not happen again. True. But this is not a moment in which the regime has become less repressive. While it may be true that the total number of people arrested and executed for so-called counter-revolutionary crimes declined after the war, as compared to the 1930s, the total number arrested and in Gulag camps actually sharply spikes. The Gulag reaches its largest population in its history in the early 1950s, primarily as a result of incredibly harsh laws on theft of state property, largely enacted as a response to the years of the post-war famine. Yet what do we read about the Gulag here, for example? We read, by the last years of Stalin's reign, there was an established trend towards converting prisoner slave labor into a civilian workforce spurred on by economic incentives. When Stalin died, the gates of the Gulag were prized open and the whole system soon dismantled, but the preliminary steps had been taken while he was still alive. It kind of misses what is actually happening here. By the late 1940s, yes, there are proposals inside the Gulag apparatus to release a substantial number of prisoners. But nobody's willing to bring this to Stalin. Nobody's willing to promote a policy like this. And so it's actually only possible to make this move after Stalin dies. And so we do find that amnesty that's promulgated 3 weeks after Stalin dies had already been proposed inside the Gulag apparatus. But nobody was willing to take it to the dictator. And by the way, even that amnesty excluded political prisoners, and it's simply not a very quick case in which the Gulag ends at this point. So I do feel a bit like Eric, I think, in places that one searches in vain for a real extended consideration of the human experience of these peoples in this book. While they are thrown into a paragraph here or there, I think clearly Roberts wants to turn our attention somewhere else. Thus, even the mass rapes in Eastern Europe are supposed to be eclipsed in our mind by the liberation of the Nazi death camps. And besides, Stalin is given credit for one particular article in Pravda in which Ilya Ehrenberg was criticized. It doesn't sort of undo everything that has come before. It's not a problem, I think, as a historian. It should not be a problem to say that, yes, Stalin deserves some credit for this victory in this war. But to also say that he deserves our condemnation and our judgment. And yes, I mean, judgment, sharp, severe moral judgment. We should be morally outraged for the excessive deaths that went along with his regime, for the prosecution of this war. And to say the world is better off because the Soviet Union won the war rather than Hitler, I don't think is an adequate answer to the question. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Well, I think we have quite a bit to talk about. We have about 20 minutes for questions and comments. I'd like to give Jeff.
I think I should say something first.
I'd like to give Jeff a possibility to react.
I still want to
take a couple of minutes to
Despite
react.
that, I still want to
Yeah.
thank them for their contributions and for the trouble they've taken to read the book. I think maybe they could have read it a bit more carefully, but thanks very much. I'm sorry that you're troubled by the book, both of you. I just have to tell it the way I saw it. Just some few brief points. Firstly, this is a book about Stalin and his leadership. It's not about anything else. It's not about the experience of Stalin. It's not about the victims. It's not about why the soldiers fought. It's a perspective that's focused on Stalin. That is its contribution. If you want to discuss and criticise that contribution, that's fine. But please don't tell me I should have written another book, I should have done this, I should have done that. This is just purely a contribution. Secondly, I agree that in trying to counterbalance a lot of the criticism that's made against Stalin, I maybe bent the stick too far in the other direction. I think that is a fair comment, but it's just completely not true that I in any way avoid the issues to do with Stalin and his regime and the moral repugnance we have to have that regime. Everything is there in the book. Okay, it's not done in huge detail, but then the book is not about, as I say in the preface, the book is not a catalogue of Stalin's crimes. That's not his function. But I have to say, look, being morally repugnant, condemning the Stalin regime is easy. And actually, in my opinion, it's self-indulgent for historians to do that, when what they should be doing is helping us to understand Stalin, understand the Soviet system, understand how it was possible, including how it was possible for such a system to win such a war and actually benefit the rest of humanity. Thirdly, Eric raised a question about the character of the book. Yes, the book is, and I'll just defer by, the book is mainly about Stalin's war leadership. But there is a connection between Stalin's war leadership and the treatment of the Cold War, and indeed the treatment of domestic policies. In relation to the Cold War, the connection is this, is that Stalin's role as a diplomat is a very important, indeed a crucial aspect of his war leadership. And that is the connection with the diplomacy of the Cold War. Why was Stalin such a successful, such an effective war leader? It was because of the role that he played in a multiplicity of spheres. Yes, he made mistakes, but he learned from those mistakes. The whole book is about trying to present a picture of how effective Stalin was in running the Soviet war in its various dimensions. And if you just can't see that, then really, there's nothing more I can say. I mean, it's in the book, and I invite everyone to read the book and tell me how I fail to actually present this picture of an effective war leader that Stalin was.
Thank you. We'll go to questions, but why don't we take 2 or 3 at a time and give the panelists the opportunity to respond. We'll start with
you. He was first and I was second.
I'll just go ahead since I'm the chair and decided you're going to go first.
Okay, this is a more or less neutral question for the panel, for the whole panel. And it has to do with counterfactuals, which some of you mentioned. And it has to do with the alternative to Stalin as a war leader. Now, recognizing, as I'm sure you all do, the crimes and the stupidities, the bad decisions of Stalin during the war, recognizing that, what would have been any feasible, plausible, successful alternative to Stalin who, A, actually possessed charismatic leadership, and B, more important, that charisma was amplified by an enormous cult of Stalin beginning in 1929. Would you have Kaganovich, Voroshilovich, Marinkov, or whatever? That's my question.
Thank you. Gentleman right up front and then all the way in the back.
Yes, I guess this question also would be for the panel, and particularly Professor Roberts. I'm going to speak in sort of general terms. A post-war settlement that the Western leaders could have engaged in that would have averted the Cold War, I don't see the West as being the aggressor in the period that you're talking about at all. Effectively, there might have been some minor statements made. I don't know, maybe you say they're not minor. But for the most part, we accepted Soviet occupation of Central and Eastern Europe. We let them go into the Pacific. Why should we have allowed them to grab territory in the Pacific? Accepting the surrender, the Japanese surrender in North Korea, establishing a base in Manchuria, and then we later cut off aid to the Chinese government, which was very helpful to the Soviets. So I'm wondering, what more could we have done? And how could any of those actions be seen as anti-Soviet? We gave them a lot of power.
Thank you. Could you identify yourself? And I'd like to ask everybody
Frank
else.
Fletcher.
I'm Richard Stites, Georgetown University.
Okay. And gentlemen all the way in the back. Back there.
Yes, Thomas Julian. I'm an independent scholar. I'm wondering how one of the kinds of activities or decisions that Stalin seems to have made during the course of the war fits into your picture of him as an effective war leader. I'm referring to his refusal to accept certain kinds of aid. Certainly Lend-Lease he wanted. He was always pressing through Molotov, etc., for a second front. But, for example, in the halcyon first days of the war, when Hopkins went to talk to him, he offered to let American troops fight on any part of the front he wanted. He had a Hurricane Squadron that was Murmansk for a while. I refused, however, an Anglo-American Air Force in the Caucasus in 1942 at a time which was quite critical, Stalingrad, etc. Accepted a French fighter squadron, and yet the French were not going to be a post-war power, so that didn't seem to fit into his attitude toward the maintaining of the Grand Alliance. He did, however, and also he turned down an offer to provide torpedo aircraft to protect the vital convoys coming into Murmansk and in the northern ports. Yet, he did accept in 1944, after much wrangling, the deployment of U.S. Army Air Forces people to 3 bases in Ukraine. And there were operations there. It was a very highly restricted number of people. The question is, why did he do that, particularly when, as a result of the refusal to allow Poltava to be used to succor the Poles, there was a very sharp reaction on the part of some of the Americans. When he reported to Washington, Harriman used the phrase, these are men bloated with power, and so forth. In fact, there was a Polish historian here in 1943 who viewed the start of the Cold War as that refusal. How do you see this kind of pattern fitting into your picture of Stalin as an effective leader and what he might have wanted for the post-war world?
Thank you all for your questions. We'll give the panelists a chance to respond and then go to another round. And I've got...
Okay, briefly. Firstly, there was no alternative to Stalin because it was Stalin's system. Yeah. It was Stalin's system, yeah? The whole system functioned around his leadership. If his leadership collapses or doesn't function sufficiently or effectively enough during the war, then I think the Soviets lose the war. That's the answer to that question. Secondly, I'm not saying the West was an aggressor. Quite simply, I'm saying the Soviets were no more the aggressor than the West were. What could the West do? Well, maybe they could have seen that or perceived that correctly. Of course, on the other side, maybe Stalin and well, not maybe, but very definitely, Stalin and the Soviets could have done a lot more to persuade the West to accept their bona fides as far as continuing post-war cooperation. In terms of the last question, in terms of the issues of this aid, well, I don't know specifically what was going through Stalin's mind, but what the Soviets often said when they were made with his offers were they made practical objections about how the problems it would create for them by setting up bases here or accepting these forces. So I would say it's those kind of reasons that explain why certain forms of aid is refused rather than anything else. But if I say that, no doubt Steve is going to accuse me of making excuses for Stalin.
Yeah.
Just very briefly on the counterfactual question, there's no alternatives to Stalin as leader, perhaps, but as the person in charge of military affairs, certainly there were other people. And in fact, what's curious is that Overy, Erickson, and Glantz, the main military historians of World War II, essentially argue, if I recall correctly, that Stalin was more effective later in the war because he gave more power to his generals and stopped interfering in their operations as much. He continued to meddle, and his meddlings continued to be very disruptive and damaging. But he did it less than Hitler did, and thus he was superior. He was less worse, I guess. But the argument in this book is the reverse. Often the generals are portrayed as getting in the way of Stalin's genius, and Stalin, there are several examples where Stalin overrules them for the good. And so it's kind of a reversal of the old standard interpretation.
Can I just comment on that? The standard interpretation came from the memoirs of various Soviet generals. Now, you could say that they were being self-serving, but if I was to say that, I would be accused of being an apologist for Stalin. My reinterpretation is based on a huge range of documentation that's been published from the military archive. So we're no longer reliant on the military memoirs to make our assessments of what was going on. And it's on the basis of that, I say that we need to revise that kind of judgment. That it was just a question of Stalin actually just allowing the generals to do what they want. That's not what happened. It's a much more complex picture, and it's a much more complex relationship. And Stalin's role in that relationship is a much more positive one than has been previously suggested. But I have to say, Erickson, Glantz, Overy, they would all agree with me about how great a war leader and how essential a war leader Stalin was.
Let's see if we can include a couple of other people in the conversation. Steve, do you have anything to add?
You know, I mean, I think at this point it's probably best for Jeff to get questions from the audience rather than for me to keep jumping in.
Okay, we'll go ahead with the next round then. Gerald Schechter.
Gerald Schechter, I'm an independent historian. I'd like to ask Professor Roberts and the other gentleman to comment. What about, in your research, what did you find as to the origins of the war? What about the thesis that Stalin really wanted to attack Hitler first, and that he made a great mistake by thinking that Hitler was not going to attack Germany because his intelligence showed that they weren't prepared, the Germans weren't prepared for a winter war. And the argument is, and I'll make it quickly, that the reason that the front line was such a disaster was that Stalin had ordered the defenses taken down so that the troops would be able to attack in July. And there's supposed to be documents to that effect which still lie buried, so that you'd have a whole different approach to the question of who was responsible for starting the war.
It's an important question. Let's go to gentleman over here.
Thank you.
My name is Stephen Shore. I felt that the heart of your argument, Mr. Roberts, was that Stalin should be praised because he was at the head when the war was won, but I think the arguments against this, that the war was almost lost because of Stalin's leadership, have not been made nearly strong enough. Let's go through a number of counterfactuals. The Nazi Soviet attack...
Just
okay.
Briefly, though. We're
yes,
running
yes.
out of time, and
was not used. Stalin genuinely believed that he could trust Hitler and ignored massive warnings from throughout his spy network of the German attack. The occupation of the Baltics just earned the hatred of the Baltics. The repression of the kulaks and of Ukraine was so severe that the German army was welcomed as liberators in the Ukraine and in the Baltics when they did invade. The attack on Finland accomplished absolutely nothing but give the Germans a false impression of Soviet weakness. Anyone could point out the restaurant in Moscow where Stalin set out peace feelers in the fall as the German army approached Moscow, only to find that the terms were too high. So if we criticize Stalin for being at the top when the war was won, one should be no less vociferous in criticizing him for almost having lost the war at the start.
thank you. Any other questions? For a moment, in the back, yeah?
Yeah, John Schmidt, I'm not affiliated with, many years ago I got my degree from George Mason in history. So my question, I think the last 100 pages, but I have not read the book, much more interesting, and rather than refight the Second World War, I would like to hear some of the evidences that you had for this great, whatever that Stalin didn't want to have, he wanted detente, and then he wanted to continue the Grand Alliance. To me, that's the most intriguing thing that's been said, and I haven't really heard any specific evidence from the archives on that.
In fairness to Jeff, you should probably read the book.
Yes.
It'll be hard for him to respond to this in the minute and a half that we've got left. But Jeff, let me give you an opportunity to start.
Don't misunderstand. I'm not saying we should praise Stalin. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. No, I'm not saying that at all. No, I would never ever praise Stalin. What I'm saying is that we need to recognise his abilities and his contribution, and perhaps, you should be impressed by his abilities and his contribution, and certainly we should be glad that what he had to offer had a particular outcome, i.e. the defeat of Nazi Germany. So yeah, so I suppose I would praise Stalin for his role in the defeat of the Nazis, but that is about as far as I'm going to go. And if that makes me an apologist for Stalin, then so be it. In terms of this attack thesis, yeah, I mean, obviously there's been a big debate, dealt with in some detail in my book. What was going on was this, is that in the event of war, the Soviets were planning to attack or counterattack, and all their military plans and their deployment were based on on notions of offensive action of one kind or another. And it's because of that that they're so ill prepared when the Germans do attack. They're also ill prepared because they expect their defences to hold up and to give them time to launch their counterattack. And indeed, what I argue in the book is this kind of offensivist kind of doctrine, attitude, approach prevails throughout the war. And indeed, in the early part of the war, as I say in the book, it's quite a costly strategy. And Stalin is very much part of the problem. In fact, he's the central part of the problem, because if Stalin doesn't go along with this concept, then the concept wouldn't have been an opposite concept. But it's not Stalin's responsibility alone. It's an effect of the doctrine, it's an effect of the force structure, it's an effect of the tradition, and it's an effect of the views and attitudes of the members of his high command. So, condemn Stalin, but also find some room for some criticism of his high command and his advisors, because they were part of the problem as well.
Eric, Steve? All right, well, we've run out of time.
What about that question concerning, from the man way over there, concerning Stalin's hope for a post-war Grand Alliance or continuation of it? Was that your question?
Yeah, I mean, what were some of the evidences you found?
The evidence about it.
Briefly.
Well, the evidence is set out in the book, but basically, that's what Stalin and the Soviets were saying in public. That's what they were saying in private, and their actions are consistent with their adherence to that perspective until they come to abandon it in the middle of 1947.
Let me thank all three panelists for